A wealthy black man helped an old woman who was struggling with her luggage in an airport. When he finds out the true identity of the old woman, he instantly breaks down in a panic. James Wright sat in the corner of the bustling airport lounge, his laptop open and phone in hand, eyes locked on the screen. He was finalizing the details of a deal, one that had taken him across the country for a high-stakes meeting. Around him, the usual airport chaos unfolded. The hurried footsteps of travelers, the muffled announcements, the clinking of cups from a nearby cafe. Yet, it was all background noise. His world was orderly, focused, and controlled. That was until he noticed her. Out of the corner of his eye, James saw an elderly woman struggling with two overstuffed bags. Her movements were slow, her hands shaking as she tried to wrestle the luggage onto a cart. She was clearly struggling, yet people rushed past her without a second glance. James glanced down at his laptop, then at his watch. His flight was still an hour away. Sighing softly, he stood up and walked over to her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but firm. "Let me help you with those." The woman looked up, startled by his presence. She blinked a few times, her wrinkled face breaking into a warm, if tired, smile. "Oh, bless you," she said, her voice soft and trembling slightly. "These old bones aren't much help anymore." Without hesitation, James grabbed the bags and placed them securely on the cart. "There you go, safe and sound." "You're an angel," she said, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "I'm Evelyn, by the way, Evelyn Johnson." "James Wright," he replied, extending his hand. Her grip was frail but steady as they shook hands. Something flickered in her expression as she heard his name. A flash of recognition? She paused for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly before smoothing out. "James Wright." James raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. People often thought they knew him, perhaps from the occasional business interview or a profile in a magazine, but this seemed different. She didn't push it, and neither did he. "Where are you headed?" James asked, hoping to break the momentary silence. "Florida," Evelyn replied, adjusting her coat, which looked worn from years of use. "I'm going for medical treatment. It's nothing too serious, but at my age, these trips get a little harder each time." "Are you traveling alone?" James asked, his tone softening. "Yes, it's just me," she said, her smile fading slightly. "I've been alone for quite some time now. No family left to travel with, and, well, you get used to managing on your own." Her words struck something in him, a faint pang of familiarity that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the sadness in her voice, but something about her presence felt strangely recognizable, as if he'd seen her or heard her before. But he quickly shook off the feeling. "You shouldn't have to manage alone," James said. "It's good you're getting the care you need, but if you ever need help or someone to check on you, feel free to reach out." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for something. "You're a kind man, James Wright. You remind me of someone I once knew, but that's an old story." There it was again. That sense of something just out of reach, like a memory trying to break through. James smiled faintly, curious but unwilling to press. "Maybe one day you'll tell me that story," he said. Evelyn chuckled softly. "Maybe I will." She reached into her bag, pulled out a small notepad and scribbled something down. "Here, take this. It's my phone number. If you do want to check in on me when you're back, I'd be glad to hear from you." James took the piece of paper, folding it neatly into his wallet. "I'll do that. I'll be back in town next week, and I'll give you a call to see how things are going." Evelyn gave him another warm smile, but there was a depth to it now, a mixture of gratitude and something unspoken. "You don't meet many people like you anymore, James. I appreciate it." They shared a brief but meaningful silence. As James helped her push the cart toward her gate, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. The sense of familiarity gnawed at him, but he couldn't place it. Her reaction to his name, her searching look, it all felt off. "Safe travels," he said as they reached her gate. "You too, dear," she replied. "And don't forget, you promised to call." "I won't," James said, with a small wave before heading back to his seat. As he settled into his chair, he pulled out the small piece of paper with her number again. Her words echoed in his mind, but it was more than just her words. There was something about her, something that had stirred something deep within him. The boarding call for his flight broke through his thoughts. Shaking his head, he put the paper away, packed up his things, and headed to his gate. But as he boarded the plane, a strange feeling lingered, pulling at the back of his mind. Something about this encounter, about Evelyn Johnson, felt like more than just a coincidence. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he knew this was only the beginning. The week flew by in a blur of meetings, presentations, and late-night emails. For James Wright, it was business as usual. Yet, even amidst the fast pace of his professional life, something kept nagging at him. Evelyn Johnson. The old woman's name had stuck with him, like a song he couldn't get out of his head. And then there was that feeling, the strange familiarity that kept tugging at the corners of his mind. He had promised to check in on her, and despite how busy his schedule was, James had found himself thinking about that promise more often than he'd expected. She was just an elderly woman he'd met at the airport, yet their brief encounter felt far more significant than it should have. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. On Friday afternoon, after his last meeting, James found himself driving toward a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. He had called the number Evelyn had given him, and they'd arranged a time for him to visit. As he pulled into the small, nondescript apartment complex, a pang of discomfort hit him. This place felt worlds away from the upscale, polished life he led. He parked his car and walked up to the entrance of her building. The hallways were dimly lit, the paint peeling slightly, and the air smelled faintly of musty carpets. It was the kind of place that spoke of years gone by, where the walls had likely witnessed hundreds of stories just like Evelyn's, people growing old, forgotten by the fast-moving world outside. James found her door, number 4B, and knocked lightly. For a moment, he wondered if this had been a mistake, if perhaps his curiosity was misplaced. But then the door opened, and there she was. Evelyn looked even smaller in her apartment. Her frail frame was wrapped in a thick cardigan, and her hair, now pulled back in a loose bun, revealed the sharp lines of her face. She smiled warmly at the sight of him. "James, you kept your promise," she said, her voice filled with genuine surprise and joy. Come in, come in." James stepped inside, noting the modest but tidy surroundings. The apartment was small, a bit cramped, with mismatched furniture and a few old photographs lining the walls. It was a far cry from the sleek, modern spaces he was used to, but there was a homeliness here that he found oddly comforting. "How have you been?" James asked, sitting down in a worn armchair by the small coffee table. "Oh, you know, the usual," Evelyn said with a shrug as she settled into the couch. "Doctors, treatments. They say I'm managing, but it's tiring." James nodded, unsure of what to say. The weight of her illness hung in the air, but Evelyn didn't seem eager to dwell on it. Instead, she shifted the conversation in her usual manner, casually, effortlessly. "It's nice to have company, though. It gets lonely here sometimes." Her eyes flicked to the photos on the wall for a brief second before returning to him. "Not many people to talk to these days." James felt that tug of familiarity again, stronger now. He glanced at the photos, a much younger Evelyn with a man in one, a group of children in another, and in the corner, a small framed photograph of a baby. Something about that picture made his stomach turn, though he wasn't sure why. "You don't have family nearby?" James asked, keeping his tone casual. No, Evelyn said with a small sigh. "No family left, really. I had a few close ones once, but things didn't work out the way I'd hoped. Life has a funny way of taking people away when you least expect it." She paused, her gaze lingering on the baby photo. James noticed it, the way her fingers absent-mindedly reached for the frayed edges of the pillow on her lap, a telltale sign of something unresolved. "I was married once," she continued, "a long time ago. We wanted children, but it never happened. Then, one day, I found a baby, left at the hospital where I worked as a nurse. A tiny thing, abandoned. He was just a few days old." James froze, a strange sensation washing over him as she spoke. "I took care of him for a while, loved him like my own," Evelyn said, her voice growing softer. "But I didn't have much. No money, no support. I couldn't give him the life he deserved. So, after a few months, I gave him up for adoption." James felt his throat tighten. His heart began to race, and he swallowed hard, trying to push away the growing suspicion that had crept into his mind since she'd started speaking. "And what happened to him?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn looked at him with a strange, almost haunted expression. "I don't know. I've always wondered where he ended up, if he had a good life, if he's happy." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That must have been hard," he said, his voice tight. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," Evelyn admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. "But sometimes, you have to make choices that break your heart for the sake of someone else." James felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck. The details of her story were too close, too specific. He couldn't deny the eerie familiarity any longer. "That baby," he said slowly, struggling to keep his voice steady. "When did you find him?" Evelyn looked up at him, confused for a moment. "Oh, it must have been almost 45 years ago now." "Why?" James swallowed, his mind racing. 45 years. His own adoption had taken place 45 years ago. He stood up abruptly, the room suddenly feeling too small, too claustrophobic. I need some air," he muttered, turning toward the door. Evelyn watched him, concern clouding her features. "James, are you all right?" "I'm fine," he lied, his hand already on the doorknob. I just need a minute. He stepped outside into the dim hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. The timeline, the circumstances, it couldn't be a coincidence, but it had to be, right? James closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe slowly, deeply. He didn't know what to think, what to believe. All he knew was that something about Evelyn's story was more than just a strange coincidence. Something was connecting them in a way he couldn't yet fully understand. James stood in the dimly lit hallway, staring at the worn carpet beneath his feet. His heart pounded, the rhythmic beat echoing in his ears as he tried to process what he'd just heard. 45 years ago. It was impossible. Coincidence, he told himself. It had to be. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, the eerie familiarity Evelyn's story had stirred in him was undeniable. His hands trembled slightly as he took a deep breath. Pushing the door open again, he had to know more. Evelyn sat where he'd left her, her hands clasped together in her lap, looking more fragile than before. She didn't say anything when he re-entered, only watched him carefully as he settled back into the armchair, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry about that," James said, his voice a little steadier now. "I just needed a moment." Evelyn smiled gently. "It's all right. Sometimes these stories from the past can hit harder than we expect." James nodded, his mind racing. "You said the baby, you gave him up for adoption. Did you ever try to find him?" Evelyn shook her head, her eyes clouding over with the weight of old memories. "I thought about it for years, but I didn't have the means. And back then, once you gave up a child, they moved on quickly. The system didn't leave many trails to follow." She paused, her eyes drifting to the small photo on the wall. "I always wondered, though, if he was safe, if he had a good life." James swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "And you don't know where he ended up?" "No," Evelyn said quietly. "I tried to make peace with that. I had to believe he was given the chance I couldn't offer him." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words heavy between them. James felt a deepening sense of dread settling in his chest, the pieces of a puzzle he never wanted to assemble falling into place on their own. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice shaking slightly. He forced himself to meet her eyes. "I was adopted 45 years ago, when I was just a few months old." Evelyn's eyes widened slightly, but she remained quiet, waiting for him to continue. "The story you told me," James said slowly, "it matches what I've always known about my adoption. My parents, they never hid the fact that I wasn't theirs biologically. They told me I'd been left at a hospital as a baby, and then adopted." Evelyn's face paled, her hand flying to her mouth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt suspended in time, as if the very air had thickened with the gravity of the realization hanging between them. "James," Evelyn began, her voice trembling. "You think—" "I don't know what to think," James admitted, leaning forward, his hands clasped together tightly. "But the details, everything you've said, it all lines up. The hospital, the timeline, everything." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, her breath coming in short gasps. "Oh my God," she whispered, shaking her head. I didn't believe I would ever find him." James felt his throat tighten as he saw the flood of emotions on her face. Shock, disbelief, hope. A hope he hadn't even realized he was holding on to himself began to surface, overwhelming and unexpected. "I don't know for sure," James said, his voice cracking slightly. "But it's too close, Evelyn. It feels like more than just coincidence." Evelyn covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "I always wondered where you were," she whispered, her voice muffled. "I wondered if you had a good life, if you were loved." James sat there, frozen, as a wave of emotion he hadn't anticipated washed over him. "I did," he said quietly. "My parents, they gave me everything. They loved me, supported me, gave me a life I couldn't have asked for. But I never knew about you." Evelyn lowered her hands, her face streaked with tears. "I had no choice, James. I had nothing to give. But I loved you. I cared for you with everything I had, even for that short time." The room seemed to shrink as the weight of their shared past filled the space between them. James's chest felt tight, like he was trying to hold back a flood of emotions that he hadn't prepared himself for. He wasn't sure what to say, how to process the fact that this woman, sitting in front of him in her small apartment, was the one who had held him in her arms before he had ever known what family meant. "I've thought about my birth family before," James said after a long silence. "But I never really believed I'd find anything. I thought it was something I'd just have to accept, that I wouldn't ever know." Evelyn nodded, her eyes still watery but filled with a new sense of clarity. "I'm sorry you never knew about me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you've turned out to be a wonderful man. I can see it." James looked away, feeling his eyes sting with unshed tears. "I don't know what this means," he admitted. I don't know where to go from here. Evelyn reached across the small coffee table, her hand trembling as she placed it gently on his. We don't have to figure it all out today, she said softly. But just knowing you're all right, that's enough for me. The simplicity of her words cut through the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. He met her gaze, and for the first time since their encounter at the airport, he let himself feel the full weight of what was happening. He hadn't just reconnected with a stranger. He had found the woman who had cared for him, loved him, even before he knew what love was. And somehow, that was enough for now. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was filled with something deeper, something unspoken but shared between them. Neither of them needed to say anything more. The connection that had eluded them for years had finally been found. And in that moment, sitting in the small apartment surrounded by old photos and fading memories, they both understood that their reunion, impossible and strange as it was the beginning of something far more important than either of them could have imagined. The drive home after each visit with Evelyn left James with a mix of emotions he hadn't experienced before. He'd built his life on control, precision, and success, but his time with her was beginning to change all that. There was something about her presence, something about the weight of their conversations, that made him question everything he thought mattered. He found himself visiting her more often. What had started as simple check-ins turned into regular visits. Every few days, he'd stop by her small apartment, bringing a meal or just some company. And each time, their conversations deepened. One afternoon, as James knocked on her door, he found Evelyn slower than usual to answer. When she finally opened it, she looked pale, her usual energy replaced by a quiet fatigue. I didn't mean to keep you waiting, she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. I've had a rough day. The treatments, they're starting to take more out of me. James frowned, his concern growing. Is there anything I can do? Maybe bring you something to help? Evelyn shook her head as she sank into her worn armchair. No, dear, there's not much anyone can do at this point. She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her cup of tea. It's the cancer. The doctors told me it's progressing faster now. James sat down, watching her carefully. The frailty in her movements was new, a sharp contrast to the spirited woman he'd met just weeks ago. I knew when I started these treatments it was a gamble, she continued, her voice soft but steady. At this stage, they don't give you much hope, but you keep going, thinking maybe, just maybe, you'll get more time, even when you know it's borrowed. James didn't know how to respond. The words felt heavy, laden with a truth he wasn't prepared to confront. He had seen people deal with illness before, but never someone who was connected to him in this way, not someone whose life had shaped his in such an unexpected and profound manner. How much time did they give you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. They don't really tell you anymore. It's just day by day now. The room fell silent, save for the faint sound of traffic outside. James struggled with the weight of her words. He had known she was sick, but hearing the stark reality of her situation made it feel more real, more urgent. You shouldn't have to face this alone, James said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. I don't want you to feel like you're fighting this by yourself. Evelyn gave him a long, tired look. I've been alone for a long time, James, but now I'm not. You've given me more than I could have hoped for. Just having you here, knowing you're a part of my life again, it's enough. He felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched her. There was a part of him that wanted to do more, to fix it, to make everything better. But there was no solution to this. No business strategy or deal he could make that would change the outcome. How bad are the treatments? He asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it from her. They're hard, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Some days I can barely get out of bed. But I keep going because, well, I don't know. You just keep going because that's what you do. You hope for a little more time. James leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. Evelyn, I want to help you get the care you need. You shouldn't be here, dealing with all of this by yourself in this small apartment. Let me move you somewhere better, where they can take care of you properly. She looked at him with surprise, then shook her head. James, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, James replied quickly. I'm offering. I want to help. There was a long pause as Evelyn studied his face, her eyes searching for something. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping slightly as if she had been carrying a weight she didn't know how to put down. If you think it's the right thing, I'll trust you, she said quietly, but I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, James said, his voice gentle but insistent. You've never been a burden. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips, though it was faint, weighed down by the exhaustion that clung to her. I don't know what I did to deserve this kind of kindness, she said softly, but thank you, James. He reached out and took her hand, feeling how cold and fragile it was. You don't need to thank me, he said, I'm just glad I can do something. In the days that followed, James made all the arrangements to move Evelyn into a comfortable care facility. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, warm, and staffed with people who could provide the kind of support she needed. Evelyn's reluctance slowly faded as she settled into her new surroundings. And though she still struggled with her illness, James could see a small sense of relief in her eyes. He visited her every day. Some days they talked, and other days they sat in silence, enjoying the quiet presence of one another. And as her condition worsened, James found himself canceling meetings, stepping away from work, and spending more and more time by her side. One evening, after she had finished another exhausting round of treatment, Evelyn turned to him, her face pale but her eyes bright with a quiet resolve. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you've given me more than I ever could have asked for. You've given me peace. I want you to know that." James felt his heart tighten in his chest. He had come into her life thinking he was helping her, but somewhere along the way, she had given him something he hadn't expected. She had filled a void he hadn't even realized was there. "You've given me something too," James said softly. "I didn't even know how much I needed this. To know you, to be here." Evelyn smiled weakly, her eyes closing as she leaned back into the pillows. "Sometimes life surprises you," she murmured. "In the best ways." James watched her as she drifted off to sleep, his hand still holding hers gently. And in that quiet room, surrounded by the steady hum of the medical equipment, he realized how much his world had shifted. What had started as a chance encounter had become something more, something he couldn't define but knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And in that moment, he understood that this time with Evelyn, no matter how brief it would ultimately be, was a gift, one that neither of them had expected, but both desperately needed. Chapter 5. Preparing for Goodbye. James's visits to the care facility became more frequent as Evelyn's condition worsened. What started as simple check-ins to ensure she was comfortable had evolved into something much deeper. Their conversations, though fewer now due to Evelyn's fatigue, were filled with a quiet understanding that their time together was growing shorter. One evening, after yet another long day at work, James arrived at the care facility to find Evelyn sitting by the window, watching the sunset. The golden light bathed her frail frame, casting a warm glow over the room. Despite her obvious decline, she smiled when she saw him, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of weariness and peace. "I didn't think you'd come tonight," she said softly as he sat beside her. "I couldn't stay away," James replied, reaching out to hold her hand. "Besides, I missed you." Evelyn chuckled weakly, shaking her head. "You've become quite the regular around here. The nurses tease me, saying I've got the most handsome visitor in the whole place." James laughed, squeezing her hand gently. "Well, I'm not here to impress the nurses. I'm here for you." She nodded, her smile fading as she looked out the window. "I'm glad you're here, James. I've been thinking a lot lately about how quickly time slips away." He felt a pang in his chest. They both knew that the end was approaching, but Evelyn's calm acceptance of it was something he wasn't sure he could ever come to terms with. She had grown weaker with each passing day, and though her spirit remained strong, her body was failing her. "Are you scared?" James asked quietly, not sure if he was ready to hear the answer. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the question hang in the air for a moment, as if considering it deeply. Finally, she sighed and turned to him. "I'm not scared of dying, James. I've made peace with it. But I think I'm more scared of leaving things unfinished. Leaving people behind without saying what I need to say." James's throat tightened. "Like what?" She was silent for a long time, her gaze distant. Then, she looked at him with a seriousness that made him sit up straighter. "I want to make sure you know something," she began, her voice soft but steady. "That giving you up all those years ago was the hardest thing I've ever done. I carried the weight of that decision every day, but I always believed it was the right choice. For you. I want you to know that I loved you then, and I've never stopped loving you, even when I didn't know where you were." James felt his heart swell with emotion. He had spent years wondering about his birth family, wondering if they had ever thought of him, if they had ever cared. Now, hearing those words from Evelyn, knowing the sacrifices she had made, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't realized he was searching for. "I've wondered about you my whole life," James admitted, his voice thick with emotion, "and I never knew if I'd find the answers. But now that I have, I can't imagine my life without you in it. I'm so grateful that we found each other again." Evelyn smiled through her tears, reaching out to touch his cheek. "You've made these last months bearable, James. You gave me a gift I never thought I'd get, the chance to see the man you've become." He leaned into her touch, his own tears welling up. "I wouldn't be who I am without you, even if I didn't know it until now." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint hum of the facility around them, James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had always thought that reconnecting with his past would answer questions, fill in gaps, but now he realized it had done something far more profound. It had given him the chance to connect on a deeper level, to forge a bond that transcended time and distance. After a while, Evelyn spoke again, her voice even softer now. "There's one more thing I need to ask of you, James." "Anything," he replied without hesitation. "When the time comes and I'm no longer here, I want you to make sure that I'm remembered, not as someone who gave up a child, but as someone who tried to do the best she could with what she had. I want you to remember me with kindness, not regret." James swallowed hard, the thought of losing her suddenly feeling unbearably close. "I promise, Evelyn, I'll remember you that way, always." She smiled, a faint but content expression on her face. "Thank you. That's all I need." The sun had set by the time James finally rose to leave. He stood by her bedside for a long moment, taking in the fragility of her form, the calmness in her expression. She looked at peace, though her body was failing her. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said softly, leaning down to kiss her forehead. Evelyn smiled, her eyes fluttering shut. "I'll be here," she whispered. As James walked out of the care facility, the weight of the evening pressed heavily on his heart. He knew that time was running out, and soon their conversations, their shared moments, would come to an end. But as painful as it was, he also knew that what they had built together, the bond they had forged, would stay with him forever. In the quiet of his car, James sat for a long time, reflecting on everything they had talked about. He had come into Evelyn's life thinking he was there to help her, to ease her final days. But in truth, she had helped him. She had given him a deeper understanding of love, sacrifice, and the importance of connection. And as he drove home that night, James knew that when the inevitable happened, when Evelyn was gone, he would carry her memory with him, just as she had carried him all those years ago. A few days passed, and with each visit, James could see the inevitable creeping closer. Evelyn's health was declining rapidly. Her once sharp and spirited conversations had become shorter, quieter, as if she were slowly withdrawing from the world. It was hard to watch, harder than anything James had ever experienced in his otherwise controlled and orderly life. One evening, when James arrived at the care facility, the nurse met him at the door with a somber expression. "She's been asking for you," she said softly, leading him down the hall. James felt his heart tighten. The weight of those words lingered in the air as he followed the nurse, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he entered Evelyn's room, the dim light made everything feel softer, almost dreamlike. The air was thick with quiet, save for the steady beeping of the machines and the faint hum of life-supporting devices. Evelyn lay in her bed, her body frail and pale, her breath shallow and labored. She looked smaller than ever, almost fragile enough to disappear into the sheets. But when her eyes flickered open and she saw him standing there, a faint smile tugged at her lips. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "I'm here, Evelyn," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." She smiled faintly, her fingers weakly curling around his. "You always keep your promises," she murmured. Her voice was so quiet now, as if each word took all the strength she had left. He swallowed the lump forming in his throat, his free hand gently brushing a strand of her silver hair away from her face. "I've tried," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I will, until the very end." For a long while they sat in silence, the world around them fading away. James felt the weight of all their conversations, the memories, the connection they had built, resting between them. He knew, deep down, that this was their final moment together. The thought crushed him, but he also knew that this was something he couldn't change, something he had to accept. "You've given me so much," Evelyn whispered after a while, her voice barely a breath. "More than I could have ever hoped for." James shook his head, tears blurring his vision. "No, Evelyn, you gave me more. You gave me answers, closure, love." Her eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, glistened with unshed tears. "I'm so proud of you, James. I always knew you'd turn out to be a good man." He squeezed her hand gently, his heart aching. "I'm only who I am because of you." Evelyn's breathing grew shallower, her eyes fluttering as if they were becoming too heavy to keep open. "Promise me something," she whispered, her voice so faint that James had to lean closer to hear. "Anything," he said, his voice trembling. "When I'm gone, don't be sad for too long. Remember the good, not the sadness. And keep living, James. Don't get stuck in the past." James blinked back tears, nodding even though it felt impossible at that moment. "I promise," he whispered, his voice barely holding together. "I'll remember you always, Evelyn, with nothing but love." A small, peaceful smile touched her lips, and her eyes closed slowly. "Thank you for everything," she breathed, her voice so soft it was almost as if the words were carried on the air itself. Her hand, still nestled in his, grew weaker, her fingers loosening their grip. The beeping of the machines began to slow, the sounds becoming distant as if the room itself was letting go. James sat there, holding her hand, tears falling silently down his face as he watched the life slowly leave her. It was a peaceful passing, quiet and full of grace. There was no fear in her final breaths, only the soft, steady release of someone who had found peace. For what felt like an eternity, James stayed with her, holding her hand long after her last breath. He wasn't ready to let go, not yet. The room felt too quiet, too empty without her soft voice, without the gentle presence that had come to mean so much to him in such a short time. Finally, when the nurse returned to the room, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, James knew it was time to leave. Slowly, he stood, his legs feeling weak beneath him, but he forced himself to walk out of the room, out of the facility, into the cool night air. Outside, the world was quiet, almost eerily so. James looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling faintly above, and he thought about everything that had led him here. The chance meeting at the airport, the strange feeling of familiarity, the slow, beautiful reconnection they had shared. Evelyn was gone, but she had left behind something far more lasting than sadness. She had given him the closure he never knew he needed. She had shown him the power of love, of sacrifice, and of reconnecting with the past. And though the pain of her loss weighed heavily on him now, he knew that her memory would always be with him. As James stood there, his heart aching, but full of love for the woman who had once given him up, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would keep living, just as she had asked. He would remember her, not with sadness, but with gratitude for the time they had shared. And as he turned and walked to his car, the night air cool against his skin, James knew that this was not an ending. It was a continuation of her legacy, of their bond, and of the lessons she had left him with. In the stillness of the night, James drove home, his heart heavy but at peace, knowing that Evelyn had found hers as well. The funeral was a small, intimate affair, attended by only a handful of people. James stood at the front, beside Evelyn's simple wooden casket, his heart heavy with the finality of it all. The day was overcast, the sky a pale gray that seemed to mirror the quiet sorrow that filled the air. Evelyn had lived a quiet life, unnoticed by many, but the impact she had made on James was immeasurable. As he watched her casket being lowered into the ground, he felt the familiar ache in his chest, the same one he'd felt that night in her care facility as she had slipped away. When the ceremony ended, James lingered by the grave long after everyone else had left. He hadn't spoken at the funeral. He couldn't find the words. But now, in the stillness of the cemetery, he felt the urge to say something, even if only to himself. "I don't know what I was expecting when I met you," he said quietly, his voice barely rising above the breeze. "I didn't think I'd find anything, let alone you." He knelt down, placing a single white rose on the fresh soil. "You gave me more than you'll ever know. More than I ever knew I needed." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he could manage. There was no grand speech to sum up what Evelyn had meant to him. Only a quiet, profound understanding that their brief time together had changed his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. After a few more moments of silence, James stood, feeling a bittersweet sense of closure wash over him. He had fulfilled his promise to her. She had been remembered not as someone who gave up, but as someone who had given everything she had in the face of impossible choices. As he left the cemetery, the sun peeked through the clouds, casting a soft, golden light on the path ahead. It felt symbolic, as if the universe was offering him a quiet reassurance that, though Evelyn was gone, her memory would live on, not just in the past, but in everything he did moving forward. The days following the funeral were difficult. James had thrown himself back into work, trying to fill the void left by Evelyn's absence with the busy routines of meetings, deals, and deadlines. But no matter how hard he tried, there was always a lingering sense of something missing. He found himself thinking about her constantly. Small things, like a cup of tea, or the way the sunlight streamed through his office window, would bring memories of their conversations flooding back. He missed her gentle voice, her quiet wisdom, the way she had looked at him with a mixture of pride and love that he hadn't realized he craved. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk, staring at the stack of papers in front of him, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the care facility where Evelyn had spent her final days. They had kept her few belongings for him to collect, a small box of personal effects that she had left behind. James hadn't expected it to hit him so hard, but as he drove to the facility, a knot formed in his stomach. He hadn't been back since the day she passed, and now, the thought of going through her things felt like opening a wound that hadn't fully healed. When he arrived, The nurse handed him the box with a sympathetic smile. "She didn't have much, but she talked about you often," she said quietly. "I think you meant more to her than you realize." James nodded, unable to find the words to respond. He thanked her and drove home with the box in the passenger seat, its presence feeling heavier than it should. Once home, he sat on the floor of his living room, the box in front of him. For a long time, he just stared at it, unsure if he was ready to open it. But eventually he reached out, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside were a few items: a small photo album, an old wristwatch, a worn book of poetry, and a letter addressed to him. The sight of her handwriting on the envelope made his breath catch. He hadn't expected this. With shaky hands, he opened the letter, unfolding the piece of paper inside. The handwriting was delicate, slightly shaky, but unmistakably hers. "Dear James, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here. I wanted to leave you something, even though I know words could never fully express how much you've meant to me. Finding you again was a gift I never thought I'd receive. You gave me peace in my final days, and for that, I will be forever grateful. I know you'll be fine. You've always been strong, even if you didn't realize it at first. But I want you to know that wherever I am now, I'm watching over you. I'll always be with you. In every step you take, in every decision you make, you carry a part of me with you, just as I carried a part of you all those years ago. Don't be afraid to live, James. Don't let the past hold you back. You have a future ahead of you, a bright one. And I hope you remember that true wealth isn't measured in success or material things. It's measured in the connections we make, the people we love, and the lives we touch. You've touched my life in ways I can't describe. I hope I've done the same for you. With all my love, Evelyn." By the time he finished reading, tears streamed down James's face. He hadn't realized how much he needed this. Her final words, her final gift. It felt like a small piece of her was still with him, guiding him forward even though she was gone. He carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the box, his heart heavy but full of gratitude. Evelyn had given him more than closure. She had given him a sense of purpose, a reminder that life wasn't just about success and achievements, but about the connections that shaped him. For the first time in weeks, James felt a sense of peace. He wasn't sure where his life would take him from here, but he knew one thing for certain. Evelyn had left an indelible mark on his heart, and he would carry her memory with him, always. As he sat there, staring at the box of her belongings, James made another quiet promise. He would live his life in a way that honored her, embracing the lessons she had taught him. He would not let the past hold him back, but instead move forward with the strength and love she had shown him. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. Evelyn's presence, her love, and her memory would be with him every step of the way. Months passed since Evelyn's funeral, and James found himself standing at a crossroads in life. The work that had once defined him, the deals and contracts that used to fuel his ambition, now felt hollow. Every day, as he sat in his office or attended meetings, his thoughts drifted back to Evelyn, her words, her quiet strength, and the profound impact she had left on him. The letter she had written still rested in the drawer of his nightstand, and on nights when sleep eluded him, he would pull it out, reading over the lines she had left behind. "Don't be afraid to live, James. Don't let the past hold you back." Her words echoed in his mind, pushing him to consider what his life could be, beyond the walls of his office and the expectations of his career. One evening, as James sat in his living room, watching the flickering light of the fireplace, a thought that had been quietly growing in the back of his mind surfaced with sudden clarity. He wanted to adopt a child. The idea hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been stirring ever since Evelyn had told him about her difficult decision to give him up, and how she had carried the weight of that choice for the rest of her life. The chance encounter with her had brought him a sense of family he had never expected, and now he felt the urge to give that same chance to someone else. It wasn't an easy decision. He knew that adopting a child was a commitment that would change his life in ways he couldn't fully imagine, but the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the right path. The legacy Evelyn had left him wasn't just in the lessons she'd shared. It was in the opportunity to pass those lessons on to someone who needed them. The adoption process took time. James had to attend meetings, complete paperwork, and undergo evaluations. But he didn't mind. Every step felt like he was moving towards something meaningful, something that would fill the space in his life that had opened since Evelyn's passing. He had learned from her that life was about more than success or accolades. It was about the connections we make, the love we give. Several months later, after what felt like a lifetime of waiting, James received a call from the adoption agency. They had matched him with a young boy, a 6-year-old named Daniel. Daniel had been in the foster system for most of his life, bouncing from home to home, never finding a permanent place to belong. James remembered sitting in his office when the call came, staring out the window as the agency director told him about Daniel's background. The boy had lost his parents at a young age and had struggled to find a family that could offer him the stability and love he deserved. "We think he'd be a great fit with you," the director said. "He needs someone who can be patient with him, someone who understands that it's going to take time for him to adjust." James didn't hesitate. "When can I meet him?" The first meeting with Daniel was quiet, tentative. The boy had large, dark eyes that seemed to watch everything with a mix of curiosity and caution. He didn't speak much at first, but James could see the intelligence in his gaze, the way he carefully studied his surroundings before deciding how to interact with them. They met at the agency's offices, where Daniel sat across from James in a small room filled with toys and books. James smiled warmly, trying to make the boy feel comfortable. "Hi, Daniel," James said softly. "I'm James. I've heard a lot about you." Daniel looked up at him, his expression neutral. "Hi," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. James didn't push for more. Instead, he spent the next hour sitting with Daniel, talking softly about his interests, showing him pictures of his home, and letting him choose a book from the small shelf to take with him. By the end of the visit, Daniel had warmed up slightly, allowing himself a small smile when James told him a joke about a silly dog he'd once owned as a child. Over the next few months, James and Daniel spent more time together, each visit building on the last. There were moments of progress, small breakthroughs where Daniel would laugh at one of James's stories or ask to play a game with him. But there were also moments where Daniel pulled back, retreating into the quiet, cautious shell he had built around himself after years of instability. James didn't mind the ups and downs. He knew it would take time for Daniel to trust him, to believe that he was there to stay. The patience Evelyn had shown him during her final days had taught him that some things couldn't be rushed, that true connection had to be earned slowly, with care and understanding. Eventually, the day came when Daniel moved into James's home. It was a quiet transition. Daniel arrived with a small bag of belongings and a cautious expression, unsure of what to expect. James met him at the door, smiling warmly, trying to make the moment feel as calm and normal as possible. "Welcome home, Daniel," he said softly. Daniel nodded, stepping inside and looking around. The house was large, with high ceilings and expansive windows, but James had worked hard to make it feel warm and inviting. He had set up a room for Daniel, filled with books, toys, and art supplies, anything that might make him feel comfortable. For the first few days, Daniel was quiet, still adjusting to his new surroundings. He would sit in his room, reading or playing with toys, and though James checked in on him frequently, he gave the boy space to settle in at his own pace. Then, one evening, as James was preparing dinner, he heard a small voice from behind him. "Can I help?" He turned to see Daniel standing in the kitchen doorway, his hands fidgeting nervously. James smiled. "Of course, you can stir the sauce if you want." Daniel nodded and approached the stove, carefully taking the wooden spoon James handed him. It was a small moment, but to James, it felt like a breakthrough, an olive branch, a sign that Daniel was starting to trust him. Over the next few weeks, their bond grew stronger. They spent weekends together, going to parks, visiting museums, and playing board games. James made it a point to be there for every small victory, every moment of progress. Slowly, the walls Daniel had built around himself began to come down, and the boy who had once been so quiet and reserved started to open up. One evening, after they had finished dinner, Daniel sat on the couch with a book, his feet tucked under him. James watched him from across the room, his heart swelling with a quiet sense of pride. He had never imagined his life taking this path, but now, as he sat in the living room of his home, watching the boy who had come to mean so much to him, he knew that this was where he was meant to be. As Daniel looked up from his book and smiled at him, James felt Evelyn's presence, her words echoing in his mind once again. "Don't be afraid to live, James. Don't let the past hold you back." She had given him the courage to make this leap, to take a chance on something new. And now, he was building a family of his own, a family rooted not in blood, but in love and connection. James smiled back at Daniel, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. Evelyn's lessons had shaped him, and now he was passing those lessons on to Daniel. In that moment, James realized that the cycle of love and care that had started with Evelyn was continuing with him and Daniel. It wasn't a grand legacy, but it was one that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, James felt truly at peace with the direction his life had taken. "Ready for bed soon?" James asked. Daniel nodded, standing up and placing his book on the coffee table. "Yeah, thanks for today," he said quietly. James smiled, ruffling Daniel's hair. "Thank you too. I'm glad you're here." As Daniel headed off to his room, James sat back, feeling the quiet joy of a life well lived. He had chosen a different path, one that wasn't defined by success or wealth, but by the love he had found and the family he had built. And in that, he knew he had honored Evelyn's memory in the best way possible.